So today we have Gestal again talking with us, the same people from last meeting. Dr. Hyatt Frobos serves as the USA Commercial Director and Nutritionist for the JYGA Technologies, a Quebec-based company producing Gestal brand precision feeding systems for the swine industry. Hyatt specializes in assisting swine producers with group housing solutions and nutritional programs to optimize performance and welfare of gestating and lactating sows in commercial environments. In 2015, Dr. Frobos completed his doctorate degree in swine nutrition and management at Kansas State University. His research focused on nutrition and reproduction interactions in gestating and lactating sows and the effects of mycotoxins in pig growth. Hyatt also serves as the 2011 U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Australia and went coach the Kansas State University Collegiate Livestock Judging Team from 2010 to 2014. Hyatt is based out of Greenlee, Kansas, where he and his wife, Brandy, and daughter, Oakley, own and operate a steedstock geldie cow-calf operation. Brian Stroebel graduated with his master's from Purdue in ag engineering in 1996. His thesis was the effects of management and practices on air quality in farrowing rooms. His project was funded by the Indiana Pork Producers Association. Brian works for Gestal as a regional sales service representative in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was a contract grower and farm owner for 7 years, having farms with Smithfield and Cargill JBS. He now serves on the National Swine Improvement Federation Board and Animal Ag Allies. So I will let Hyatt and Brian take it away with their presentation.
I can go ahead and start. I know Hyatt and I have been looking forward to this to speak to the college students this evening. So thank you, Carissa and Scott and Alan for inviting us. And I know we want to keep this more science-based, not a commercial. And we're really looking forward to what questions you have. I was telling Hyatt earlier today, I said, it's been 25 years since I was at Purdue, and it's great that you have these webinars like this today. It's a great way to be able to interact remotely. So Hyatt's running the slideshow, so I can start and he'll jump in. So this is a key slide for us. I think as employees of Gestal, we pride ourselves on, we have the home farm, or anything that we produce commercially is also tested at the company farm in Quebec. So it's a 2,300 head farm. Donald and Elaine are the owners of the company, and what we provide for U.S. customers is also what's in their farm. So it's practicing what you preach, and we don't sell anything unless we have it in place there at the farm. And then some background. I think a lot of you know some history on Gestal already. So it's been what, since '94, so 27 years now that Gestal has been in business of supplying feeders. As you see, starting off with lactation feeders as being the basis of the company. And on the right, you can see the progression. Is really 2012 then we get into our modern product line showing wireless technology. That's one of our lactation feeders you see on the 2012 segment. And then we've expanded that. Yep, so we can control heat lamps or heat pads and also feed blending. And then 2014 was a milestone for Gestal being able to enter pen gestation arena. And now with all the discussion on Prop 12, that's a key piece of that discussion. And then you see in 2016, adding the wireless piece and the wireless handheld. And then just recently with the Evo for gilt developer units and for finisher units. That gives you some good background. And the key piece of this is labor. So working 24/7, equipment has to justify itself. So we really try to pay attention to the labor standpoint, especially for a U.S. market. We don't usually have a lot of labor, and it's usually higher priced. And then I like this slide also. Our goal is to maximize intake in lactation, regardless of the genetics. I think that's a very interesting discussion, and I'd be happy to, get into that discussion as well. But still, our goal is to maximize intake. And I like to say, we win either way in lactation as long as we're maximizing your intake, because it's either going to her back fat or body condition and or to the litter weight. So me as a producer, I always wanted heavier weaned pigs coming out. If I was averaging 12 pounds, that was pretty light if I'm paying for the propane. So I'd rather have a 15-pound average weaned pig coming into my barn. And then this shows more detail on the farrowing feeder, on mimicking natural eating position, like this 1 and 2 here in the bottom middle. We call that a trigger. It goes up and down. But still, it's mimicking natural eating position, keeping her head in the bowl, moving that trigger up and down to order an aliquota feed to come from our feeder attached to the feed line. And then wet, dry, or dry. I think this is a key discussion, for Indiana or further west. We talk about wet, dry quite a bit. So it doesn't matter to us. The feed dispense point is dry since it's up high. And then we can have water in the feed or not. We don't like to have a lot of feed in there. To me, that's the biggest challenge of folks going to our feeder in lactation is, you don't have to have it filled to the lip of the feeder. We know how much she's been eating by how much was dropped, and then if she's wasting it or not. And then here's some slides on what we do in today's environment, being able to communicate wirelessly in the barn. We don't have to wire from each component back to the office. And then, here's the way we do it. Like these, the blue arcs are the wireless communication signal from the feeder to the antenna, then to converter to back to the office and the computer you can see down at the bottom. So we do need power to plug in like you do for a fan, but not for communication. And then I know Hyatt will jump on here on these too, but I think these are very interesting from an animal science standpoint, on the feed curves, and then what that means in the barn on the units to see red, regardless if somebody speaks Spanish or English or Russian or Chinese. Red is typically bad, is what we're saying. So a red light here means she needs attention. And then the light on the other side of the feeder saying a meal's available, so she can eat. So like the person here in the aisle, checking, we want eyes on the sow to check, why isn't she eating? Is she lame? Can she get up? What's the reason she's not eating, even though she has meal available? And then I think this is very interesting also. Seeing the blue line is actually what is consumed by the sow. You can see the trigger, like we talked about. That's a way of her ordering her meal, and then how she interacts compared to the target. So we'd want her to be at the top of the green line. We also give her a 20% buffer above. So if she's above our target, that's acceptable. But still, if she's in the red, that would be a red flag. We want to sort those girls to the top of our list here. So here's a good example. So she was doing real well, and then boom, she dropped off. So finding out the reason for that versus the sow on the bottom, she was above target or in the green for most of her time. So finding out the reasons why. So the data is there. It's just analyzing that data on a sow-by-sow basis. And then I like this one also. This is one way to analyze data. This is how we do it. So as you can see in the middle here is lactation. So we sort our poor performers to the top because we want to have our labor pay attention to them. And anybody have questions on that, jump in and ask, because our theory is we manage by exception. So anybody that's doing well, these green sows, as you see, they're doing well, even though there's some periods of red. And this is a situation where we got 6 periods in a day. So like 5 to 8 a.m. is your first period. And then you got through the day, 8 to 11 p.m. is your last period. But on average, those girls are green. The ones at the top are yellow. I'm not showing any red average sows in this set. Then for gestation, that's a limit fed basis. It's to 100% of her maximum of her allotment has she eaten. Either she has eaten, or she's eaten a portion of it, or she's eaten her full allotment. And then this is a good data set also, showing you individual data for each sow.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Brian.
Yep.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so appreciate you guys having us back. I know we had the opportunity to talk a lot last time on gestation and particularly Prop 12 and its impact, and appreciate you having us back to talk a little bit more about our products and how they're being applied. I just wanted to, we've got a big slide set here, and there's some slides that are probably more relevant than others, but if we skip over them and you saw something that was interesting, don't hesitate to bring that up on the call, kids, because there's a lot of different things with precision feeding, and 1 hour is probably just enough to touch the tip of the iceberg. But here on this slide is just an example of how our data can be exported for research or for benchmarking. So our system, I showed you guys some slides of how that looks on a computer screen, but especially with regard to university research or commercial research, ultimately people want to get that data into a format that they can work with for data analysis. And so this is an example of a very simple export of the Gestal data on individual sows that can be rapidly put into a statistical worksheet or analysis for research. So here is several pictures that kind of illustrate how our lactation system looks in the barn. And I know Dr. Schenkel specifically wanted me to spend a little bit of time talking about feed blending in lactation and what that might look like. So Brian very nicely kind of gave you guys an introduction about how our feeders have conventionally been used, mainly for maximizing feed intake and reducing feed waste, but also as a benchmarking tool to help you find the problem sows in a herd quickly and put your labor on the outliers in a herd, not on the 95% of sows that are doing just fine. We want to manage by exception, as Brian stated. So these are just some good pictures of different commercial farms using our lactation feeders. And just to give you guys some perspective, we feed over 1 million sows globally with our lactation feeders, and that's in, I think, over 30 countries now. So we've been around for quite a while, and we're a lot of different countries. And what we do in the US and how we manage sows successfully might be a little bit different than how you manage sows in Japan or Australia or Brazil. And so we need to have systems that can be tailored and adjust to those different country by country scenarios. So these are just some good examples of different presentations. Those of you that haven't spent a lot of time in hog barns, it's good to maybe see how they can look in different orientations. But as we talk about feed blending, I'm not sure if I have a great picture of feed blending. I'm skipping through some pictures here for you guys just for time purposes. Yeah, here we go. So here's a good picture of our newest lactation feeder. And I think the upside to this from a nutritional standpoint is really exciting. And I'm a nutritionist, so I get excited about this kind of stuff a little more than some. But just to wrap your head around what we do now versus what we could do. All of you have seen pictures of the feed lines and single feeder going over each feeder or each farrowing crate. In these pictures, you can see 2 feed lines going over every farrowing crate. Remember, you guys are animal science students or you're around livestock enough, we have gilts, we have parity 1, parity 2, parity 3, and up sows on these farms. And those of you that have any background in any species know that the youngest animals are going to have the highest nutrient requirements because they're still growing. And oftentimes, they're also not able to eat as much as a mature animal. And that's regardless of species, but definitely true for pigs. Also keep in mind that throughout lactation, the demands of the piglets are going to change. In early lactation, those pigs are very small, and there's not very much drawdown of milk volume being produced by that sow as compared to in her second or third week of lactation. Despite these known variations in nutrient requirements within a herd, almost every farm in the world that I know of feeds a single feed line throughout lactation. So every sow gets the same diet, regardless of what her needs are, and we try to maximize feed intake to try to get the right nutrients to her. And if we get a little bit too much, so be it. As a nutritionist, what you usually get tasked with in this situation is you need to feed to the lowest common denominator. So if I have a lower eating gilt, even when she's limited, I need to make sure that my lactation diet nutrients match her requirements. For the sow that's able to eat 25 pounds a day and she's not still growing, we're usually overfeeding her and creating some pretty expensive urine and feces out of that sow on the backside. So as a nutritionist, if the electronics or the feed system can blend 2 different diets or more than 2 diets, it opens a whole new doorway and pathway to a new frontier of feeding sows in lactation based on their individual needs. Not only can this hopefully get sows fed better, but it also gives you the chance to cheapen up your diets a lot. And this is especially true in countries where feed costs are very high and there's a lot more regulation on environmental emissions. In the US, historically, our feed costs have not been that high because we're very good at producing corn and soybean meal. But feed costs are higher right now than they were last year. And I'm sure we're going to continue to see some times where we're going to be pushed on feed ingredient costs. Anything we can do from an infrastructure standpoint to reduce those costs and reduce the environmental emissions of these lactating sows is going to have an increasing dollar value. But this is an example of how that's presented, and we can simply program the feeder when we load that sow to know A, how old she is, B, what day of lactation she's on, and C, we can also know how many pigs she's nursing. And we can have a pre-programmed blend of 2 diets that better fit her nutrient requirements than just giving her a single diet throughout lactation. This is a relatively complex subject that even I took a while to get my head wrapped around. So I hope that I've explained it in a somewhat understandable way, but I can dive deeper if you guys have questions.
I do have a quick question. So what would be the differences between the 2 feed lines? Would one be high in nutrients and one be low in nutrients, and they both be a complete feed, or what would be the difference there?
Excellent question, Carissa. And first I'll say it could be multiple different things, but most people, when they apply a feed blending situation like this, try to have 2 complete diets. So I already kind of outlined the example. We've got a gilt that's nursing pigs and has very high nutrient demands, but relatively low feed intake, versus a sow who is done growing, has lower nutrient demands, and has really good appetite and really good feed intake. What we have in these diets is usually a percentage of, let's say, amino acids or energy or fat. But in reality, what that sow needs is on a grams per day basis of amino acids or energy. So generally speaking, if we can tailor the diet and we have 2 base diets that we can blend in different ratios, I'm going to make one diet be fed to my lowest common denominator, that low eating gilt. And I'm going to make that the most nutrient dense feed from generally an amino acid and energy basis, and combine that with a blend that is the lowest nutrient requirement, which is going to be that multi-paris sow in late lactation. She might be able to get by with a diet that's as low in amino acids as a late finishing pig, whereas a gilt might be being fed a diet that's as high as 1.1 or 1.2 or 3% lyceum, which is also quite a bit more expensive, but it's what she needs because she's not able to consume 20 pounds per day. She might max out at 12 or 13 pounds, and that we still need to make sure we meet her requirements so she doesn't get too thin and then fail to breed back on the subsequent litter.
Okay, thank you. We do have one question in the chat from Dr. Radcliffe. It's, can the system be automated to adjust a blend daily based on the previous day's feed intake?
Yeah, great question, Dr. Radcliffe. This has been on my wish list for a while, and I would tell you that from a programming standpoint, it gets a little bit tricky because it is really machine learning at that point. But we have been able to do this, and in some beta tests of our latest updates, we have this ability. What most people today are doing is they're starting with a set number of feed curves that have these set blends. So for example, if I know she's a P1 sow nursing 11 pigs with a 21-day lactation, I know the historical feed intake of the average P1 on the farm, and so I will base my diet curve based on that average. But then if she begins to deviate from that, I'll have a checkpoint every couple of days or every few days, and I can adjust her up or down a little bit from that. But the holy grail for me is that machine learning component where it makes an automated decision based on previous day's intake. And that's something that I'll be the first to admit. we're the first ones doing feed blending and lactation. This is patented. So Gestal is the only company that has this ability. But that machine learning is still getting fine-tuned a little bit, but I would say we're almost there. And that's really where I think we can realize a lot of these benefits from a labor-free standpoint. So hopefully I've covered that feed blending and lactation approach fairly nicely for you. Keep in mind, we can do this in gestating sows, and we can do this in growing pigs as well. And we'll come back around to that a little bit, but it's relatively similar presentation, just depending on what type of animal we're putting that over. So unless we have more questions on lactation, which I'll give you guys a minute if you think of something on lactation, Brian's going to take back over and give you guys a little bit better understanding of how our system works in gestation. Again, we'll skip through some slides and make sure we have some time for grow finish at the end too. But don't hesitate to interject with a question. Carissa, if you have one, just stop us and we'll address it as we go, okay?
I wanted to use this chance real quick, Carissa. I had to prepare a sheet, and hope the attendees have a pen and paper handy, because I think they probably know some of the numbers. But like we just saw in lactation, if we're making a call decision on a sow, does the folks know what a typical call price is right now for a sow? I can give you some numbers, that way you got an idea, and I want to compare it real quick before we jump into this slide. So what I looked up today for a 450 to 500 pound coal sow, let's say she's coming out of farrowing, $59 a hundredweight. So basically $268. It's even better if she's 550 pounds. She's at $357. Compare that to my market pig price. If I'm $84.60 right now per hundredweight on a 280 pound finished pig, I'm at $236. So hopefully you followed me on that. That's telling us that the coal sow is worth more than our market pig. It's even better if she's in better body condition leaving farrowing. 550 is a big sow. So there's a lot of money in the coal sow market, is what I'm saying right now. So this slide then, over-conditioned animals going into farrowing are costly. So we want to keep them in ideal body condition as much as possible. A lot of that's visual, but if we're doing that, say, once a month, we can put that on our calendar and visually body score. So we don't want a thin to become a fat as she goes out through her 10 weeks in pens, or her time in the gestation pen. We know that over-conditioned animals are not just costly because they're wasting feed, but they're not gonna eat well when they go into farrowing. To us, that's the bigger deal, because we want a heavy, big weaned pig coming out of finishing, and out of farrowing. And my selfish reason for that as a grower was I want good big pigs that are going to start well and eat well, that I don't have to babysit in my wean to finish barns. So hopefully that resonates with you well. I know it's a selfish reason, but it's a good reason for growers receiving those wean pigs from the farrow to wean facility. They want good uniform pigs, and I think that's a lot of what we try to do with sows. We want a good body condition throughout. We don't want a lot of variation in body condition. So this is what we typically see in our gestation pens. I think it's a good visual for all of us to see. So gilts and naive sows, basically self-trained. We go 15 to 20 animals on a station, and here we say there's 3 stations in this pen, for example. So and here's a good example without sows out of a pen. So it's a 2-station. We don't go any less than 2 stations in a pen. And just some from the ag engineering side or animal science side, the parts of this stall are, of course, an anti-lay bar. Since there is no water with the station, we want them to drink elsewhere. So this is just providing feed for them. And for me, a big reason is it's an RFID tag. That's what triggers, how much feed she should get. And Hyatt will tell more about that as well on, there you go, on the RFID tagging, either with a handheld like this or a stationary at the feeder, which means automatic data acquisition. So for labor, that means I don't have to do this every day. sure when I'm coming into body score or check them with the wand, I can do that, or to find red list sows. And a red list sow is a sow that hasn't eaten or that we want to find in a pen. So we pay attention to pen sizes based on what's going to farrowing. But we don't want, very large pens. It makes it more difficult to find those girls. And then this slide, pretty easy to follow, being so a NEMA-4 enclosure. On the left, you can see we're power washing it here so we don't get water into the unit. IP66, so we don't get large particles, and our other certifications. So it's meant to withstand use in the barn with feed in it or without. And then I think this is a good visual for the students to see too, how they're lined up. The pins are lined up in the barn. So this is a pretty typical layout for us. Like Hyatt was saying, this is just one feed line. That's mostly what we see. This is a 4-station pen. So rule of thumb is, okay, just take 4 times 15 sows on a station. So this is basically a 60 head pen for rough numbers. And then this is what it looks like with a sow in the pen, in the stall. So the door closes behind her and she's able to, the RFID reader here reads her tag, which dispenses the aliquota feed through the feed pipe. And then she eats it down here in the feed trough. To me, that's a key point. Is there any questions on that, how that works, how she gets fed?
Yeah, I have a question. So if she were to get thirsty and want to drink and back out, is she able to do that voluntarily before finishing her feeding, or does the pan have to be empty before she can back out?
Nope, that's a really good question. And no, she can back out at any time. It's mechanical operation of the door. So you can see on each door has 2 pivots, or 1 pivot point on each side. So she backs out, hits the rump bar, the door opens. When she's ready to go back in, she tips the door up and it closes behind her.
So
we don't have water in there for a reason, Chris. So that way, that so that she won't just camp out in there and stay in there. It's a good reason for her to leave the station. And that's also why we don't drop large quantities of feed at one time. So she doesn't leave an appreciable amount of feed in the trough for another scavenger sow to come in and eat, beyond her requirement. Because that teaches bad habits. If she knows she can get more feed, then we're teaching sows to come in, and then we can have body variation.
And Chris, if you've been around gestating sows enough, you know that they're pretty unlikely to consume what you give them, because we are not giving them as much as they'd like to eat, right? And that's why we got this protected environment. But you'll find that the amount of girls that actually leave halfway through their meal is probably in the 2 or 3% range. They almost all consume all of their feed in one sitting and then go drink afterwards. But they do have the ability to leave halfway through and then come back and get the rest of their feed later from the same station or a different station. The stations do talk to each other, which is pretty important, or else a sow would figure out that she can get fed in more than one station. And they're smart animals. They learn how to find the loopholes if you have any weakness in the system.
Okay, thank you. I was just making sure the sow after her wasn't able to finish that up and get extra, but thank you.
Well, I mean, it's still a good question because there is no scale in the feed pan. And so one of the ways that we manage that is by the speed and amount of feed that's dropped. Adding scales would add cost and add maintenance to the system, and we really want to make this as minimal maintenance as possible if it's going to hold up in a hog barn for a long time. So the key there is we don't try to feed them 5 pounds or 4 pounds in a minute, because girls will leave some behind, especially girls that are getting more feed than they maybe want to consume. Let's say a thin sow, for example, or a new gilt. Because we can feed different animals different feeding allowances in the same pen, and we can also do feed blending like I talked about in lactation. And there's some application of high and low nutrient diets or feed additives in gestation too that can be applied. So the key to what we do is we don't try to get in a foot race here. We're not trying to put 100 sows through the same station per day. We've only got 15, 16, 17 animals per station. And even if they want to stay in there for an hour and we make sure that they eat all their feed, there's 24 hours in a day, plenty of time for these girls to get their feed, get done eating, and leave without a lot of competition. And so that's kind of the secret sauce for our system is we don't try to overpopulate each station, and we have a reasonable cost per station, which allows that to be executable.
Okay, we do have one more question in the chat. Some systems can feed 80 sows per head. Yours is 15 to 20. Can you contrast yours to these feed system?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, ours is by design, so we don't want one sow to be blocking access. That'd be my first answer. I know if we have any feed outage, like up after a holiday, and my feet, when my tandem bins, you know, they're empty, and I know that happens, especially on the finisher side, but happens on the gestation side also. So there, nobody's eating. With this, we always want to make sure that if a sow's hungry, you know, she can go eat, or there's a space available. So that's why we have multiple stations, no less than 2 per pen. Usually 2 to 5 is a good sweet spot, you know, for us. But you know, and another thing is we usually start at midnight, so it gives them more chance by the time that folks show up in the morning, employees or owners, you know, at the farm, a lot of the sows have eaten already. So we don't want to just tie ourselves to one hole. We're giving them multiple options, really paying attention to the layout here. This is a good photo to show that, you know, parallel with the slats, they're walking in parallel. But, you know,
Brian,
one station's open here. Go ahead.
I think it's a relevant question for those of you that maybe have some experience around ESFs that are traditional European ESFs. I'd tell you that generally speaking in the commercial swine industry today, the word ESF oftentimes has a bad stereotype with it. They have been problematic, they are high maintenance, they have issues where sows can't eat. And so we've tried to come up with some, we don't like to be labeled ESF because of that bad moniker that's been labeled with it. Yes, they can feed 80 sows when everything is going perfectly, but we have limited labor and we often have situations where everything doesn't go perfectly on these farms. And so trying to run these systems at maximum efficiency, maximum capacity, maximum throughput is oftentimes a recipe for disaster. And if you have one station feeding 80 sows and that station goes down, you don't have a very good backup plan. And Brian mentioned it earlier, we don't do state pens with less than 2 stations. And that's mainly because we understand that sometimes things happen and a station has some type of troubleshooting that's needed. We don't want to leave a pen of sows without any way to access feed. Worst case scenario, if one station's down temporarily on a Sunday or on Christmas, hey, there's at least another station for those girls to get done eating. And if there's 15 to 20 sows per station, it's going to take them longer to get done, but we can get 35 or 40 sows through the station on a rare occasion. But trying to push 80 sows through a system is taxing that system to the limit. The way that we justify doing this is our system is about 20 to 25% of the cost of those systems that can feed 80 sows. And so we're able to do that subdivision and still make it pencil on a bottom line basis. But ultimately, trying to overstock these stations is a recipe for problems, regardless of what type of station you use.
And the other things I'd point out on this photo before we leave it is, you know, from an animal science student standpoint, you can see how they go in, enter the station, but like I was saying on the slats, parallel with the slats, paying attention to feet and legs, you know, regardless of species, but that's with swine, you know, we don't want lame sows. We want her to be able to walk to eat, right? If she's in a G stall, she just has to get up. Here, she's got to get up and walk. Here's another good example, you know, parallel with the slats, we're right along the aisleway. So personnel can check the feeders, you know, the feed screen there you see, but the feeders are right there for us at the fence line, and then they're walking parallel, so not dragging their toe across a slat, if that makes sense. And here's another good example. This is with plastic pinning or dividers. I'd say we see more of the horizontal solid rod because of our ventilation nowadays to keep the floors dry. Yep, this style's what I see more of, and I think what Hyatt sees more of too. Although we do see some of the green or other plastic panel, we just have to pay attention to dryness of the floor. That's my first consideration. I don't want to create a wet spot. It's not so much line of sight or pursuing a timid sow. And here's a partial site example. You can see where there is some more manure issue and with solid dividers. And this is most likely a Canadian example with the high roof line. But we pay attention to where the dunging patterns are. We try to keep the sows clean. It is more challenging in a partial setup. And then this, you can see the man pass on this, where the sow with the red ear tag there, you can see that's where one of our man passes is to get into the pen. And I think that's critical too from us, from an animal science standpoint of the animal pen, on labor or getting into the pen, checking animals, encourage them so we don't have to walk over a gate. Whether I'm a tall person or a short person, it's harder to, here they walk right through the man pass.
This is also a good image, Brian, for them to see what it looks like when we have feed blending and gestation. So we, again, have 2 feed lines and have 2 compartments that can be pre-programmed for each sow to give a custom blend. Or if we're doing a research trial, we can feed some sows in the pen one diet and other sows in the same pen another diet. From an experimental design standpoint, historically with pen sows, we would have to use pen as the experimental unit because we weren't able to feed them different diets. Now with feed blending opportunities, we can feed different sows in the same pen a different diet, which increases the statistical power of your genetics or your gestation studies by a wide margin, and can definitely give you more power long term on your research, so you can conduct it with less animal units.
Yeah, this is a real good one. I hope everybody can get a visual from this. That was one of my goals for this. But this is a good example. I know Hyatt can add to this. As you see the green, those are the stations. The light blue dots is what we're showing as waterers. You can see the dimensions. And then the blue panels, we call those loafing or nesting panels. We want to encourage the sows. You call them bedroom areas or laying areas. We tried, like you see at the bottom here, 7 foot long. That's basically the length of a sow, to encourage them to lay, against the nesting wall and keep this area in the center open as a traffic pattern. What that means to us is they're more likely to drink if there's not a sow inhibiting, her from getting to the nipple or the cup, to drink. And then these red boxes, those are what I was saying was man passes between pens, and then also from the aisle. And then another key feature here is what we call hospital pens, that swing gate. And I'm a big believer in the swing gates, whether we're talking gestating sows or finishers, to be able to create a smaller pen. And then this is a good visual as well for what it looks like for stocking density. 45 head pen versus a 10 head pen. We're not showing the square footage on here, are we, Hyatt? Okay.
The point here is to show you guys that there are some advantages to smaller or bigger pens. I don't like really, really big pens because it's hard to locate girls in a 150 head pen. But there are some benefits in larger pens where we can have the same square footage, but sows will often clump together in laying areas and bedroom areas and free up the middle space for girls that are navigating. And so that's important when you're thinking about layout discussion. There are some pros and cons to large pens or small pens, and it's important as we get into the layout discussion to take those factors into account. Another good example is if you have a 1,200 head sow farm that's farrowing 60 sows a week, that's a different approach than you might want to take if you have a 5,000 sow farm that's farrowing 250 sows a week. I might not want to have a 60 head pen every week if I'm only 1,200 sows. I might want to have 2 30 head pens or 3 20 head pens so that I can group them strategically by breed day or by body condition or by parity. Whereas if I've got the ability to make 4 60 head pens every week, a 60 head pen doesn't sound so bad. And so it's important to understand that pig flow and design consideration, and that might impact the best way for you to not only have sows that have a high welfare environment, but also to allow your management to execute at a high level on managing group housing successfully. I think this is a good example of a really large pen. This is a 300 sow pen with a traditional ESF. I think finding girls in these pens is like finding a needle in a haystack. And a lot of these systems might have the ability to sort a girl out if she's nearing farrowing and whatnot. That's all well and good until she stops eating. When she stops eating and somebody's got to go hunt for her in the pen, I can tell you that I don't think it's very much fun finding a girl in a 60 head pen. A lot less fun in a 300 sow pen. And so that's part of the reason we try to keep it reasonable on the number of sows in the pen in order to make sure that management can execute what we ask them to do from an SOP standpoint.
Yeah. The water is another key part of our discussions. I know we've got some installations going into Indiana in the next week, and we've talked about water with those producers quite a bit. And a few weeks ago, I was telling, this is my opinion versus what might be fact. And I was told, hey, we want to hear your opinion. So I always try to clarify that. We talk about where the water is located, and then what type of water is it? Is it a cup? Is it a pool of water, or is it fresh water from a nipple? And I hope the students on the call remember this, because when I first had to deal with this with integrators, they've got their set SOPs or requirements. This is what we are providing. So we can have our opinions, but if they want nipples or swinging nipples or gate mounted nipples, that's what they're going to have. So I think hopefully you've seen that already, or please try to remember that. So what we're doing here with gestating sows is we want the floor to be dry, but we do want to provide clean water. So I'll tell you that I'm a proponent of nipples over cups, even though we're mentioning both, because a lot of times when I walk into a gestation pen, I see 4 or 5 cups in the pen, but 2 of them have manure in them, and they haven't been cleaned, and the sows aren't drinking out of them. So hopefully you're taking that the right way. That's my opinion, because that's what I see. Some people like this, there's a cup right here, and that's one of our hospital pens. I know it's choice. We show, here's what the options are, but at the end of the day, I want fresh water. And yes, I'll have some wastage, and that's another discussion point, but it can be provided either way. It's a water point. Again, our premises are we want a dry floor. We want to provide enough water for each of the sows, and so it's easy to get to. So I don't want sows laying in front of my water, so, we can't access it. And I'm happy to take questions on that, because I know it's an opinion, but my opinion is based on what I've seen over the years. And here's another key point I should mention too on the hospital pen. So this is a neat feature that doesn't take away from our existing floor space. So whether, we've been talking a lot about Prop 12, a few weeks ago, and we have, seems like daily discussions on Prop 12. So I'm not losing square footage for one, because I don't have to take her to a stall if she's lame, or I can keep her with her group. I just close this swing gate here, and I've created my pen. And then here you can see I drop feed with my red head or my feed drop, and I've got water. So she's got her own area to recuperate. But as you see on the left here, we deal with these removal numbers quite a bit. So I consider this system a middle of the road system. I can target feed, I can do appropriately sized pens versus floor feeding or stanchions. Look at my removal rates versus this type of setup. When I talked about what the price of a coal sow is, if she never makes it to be a coal sow, I'm 10% plus, that I've lost based on the type of system. And we think those are conservative numbers. So hope that rings a bell, or, you can think through that. But of course, our goal is to keep her alive as long as possible, get as many parities out of her as we can. But what we're saying is there's a lot of competition in that floor feeding or stanchion system.
Well, Brian, I'd just add into, those of you that maybe have spent some time in sow barns, especially predominantly gestation created sow farms, it's important to realize that when we put girls in groups, we're putting them at risk of having aggression events. When sows are mixed together, they're going to have dominance hierarchy established. We can do everything in our power to minimize that with good design, but inevitably, it's not going to be 0 sows that end up lame or damaged from those events. And so having some type of hospital pen is critical. And one of the key mistakes that I've seen people do in group housing in a lot of cases is they say, oh, well, we can take that hospital girl back to a stall nearby. Well, in some cases, we don't have stalls nearby, or we don't have other pens nearby. A lot of times we're retrofitting barns and the whole barn is made up of gestation pens. If you're asking a worker to walk a lame sow 500 feet or something to get her back to a hospital area, guess what? It's not going to get done. They may treat the sow in the pen and try to get her better from just a treatment, but if you make it hard on these guys or gals to isolate a girl and get her better, she's going to go downhill to the point that she has to be euthanized. And it's really important that we provide the right type of setting to give these girls the individual attention they need. And hopefully, if we have the right type of feeding system and design, we can minimize what percentage that is. But ultimately, if they are getting taken out at high levels, we now have sows that are taking up 2 spaces in the barn, and we've only got a limited footprint of how many sows we can have in that facility. It's important that we make sure we optimize the space that's being used, especially with California Prop 12, which doesn't allow us to use stalls and requires 24 square feet per animal. Becomes even more important there.
Yeah. This is a good slide. I mentioned that we start the clock at midnight, which is good, not just because it's the beginning of a calendar day, but that means by 6 or 7, typically when our employees get to a site, a lot of these sows have already eaten, and they can still go, and the blue is feed that's consumed, and the pink is showing, visits. So they can have visits even though they've already eaten their allotment. We try to discourage that, but they know, was this 10 o'clock here at 2200 hours? So they know midnight's coming, they're going to get fed again. So what we try to do is keep this tail we want a long, small tail here. So basically I could say we're basically done by 1400 hours or 2 o'clock. So we want to be done, shortly after lunchtime. And this is a good slide also, I think, for parity segregating, based on number of stations. In option B, we're 10 stations less than we are in option A. And you can see go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was going to say they're all good slides because I made them. I customize these things. So but Brian was accurately illustrating here. One of the things that I really try to push people towards as a nutritionist is, I know I broke down feed blending and lactation. In gestation, we can do feed blending, but we should probably be putting young sows together and old sows together from a behavioral standpoint. So if we have, from a behavioral standpoint, the young sows separated from the old sows, the young sows need a little bit extra stations because they're learning the system for the first time, but they also probably need a little bit different diet because their nutrient requirements are higher because they're both growing and pregnant. But those older sows that are just on maintenance diets and they already know the Gestal system or whatever system's being used, we can save the producer money and we can also feed them a cheaper diet, again, saving money long-term on nutrient costs. And so it kind of has some good synergies between it, but it's important for the production flow and the system to understand the way to flow those and the benefits of separating old and young sows to help mitigate some of those aggression events and sow losses.
Yeah, and this is a good slide for memory also. I know once you see it, a lot of times you remember it better. So this is a good slide to show, hey, it's 2 3/4 inch diameter auger. That's what's delivering the feed, and basically what the Gestal system does on any of our feeders. And I know we want to talk about GDUs and finishers here too, is feed delivery, how many revolutions of that auger, and we know the density of the feed, that's how we get, our feed delivery, and how accurate we can be, within 1.5% by how many turns of that auger, and then knowing what our density is. So that's a key one, this top left to see. And then the top right, you can see that's showing, is there feed in there, and showing where our prox sensor is, or if there's feed at the bottom of the hopper is what that's showing us. So that's what the typical screen looks like.
It's just important to mention here that proximity sensor is pretty critical, because if we have a feed outage or a bridging event in a bin, which happens from time to time, we don't want a system to be telling you that it's feeding sows when there's no feed actually being dropped. So having some type of a sensor that's your fail-safe that at least allows, let's say that you have a feed bridging event at 2 a.m. Nobody finds it until 6 or 7 in the morning when somebody gets there. They fix that bridging event. We want those sows to be able to come back and get their allocated feed later in the day. That's pretty critical when those sows are spreading out their feeding events throughout the day. And it's another reason why we don't want to overload that system, because when those events happen, there's enough time left in the day for that sow for those sows to catch up and make up for those feed bridging or feed outage events that happen from time to time.
Yeah, here's an Indiana example. New fashioned pork in Indiana. Gilts training. This is an optional pin that they have. You can see that there's finished feeder on the right, and then our Gestal units, but there's no feeders at the top. You see, it's just a straight feed drop from the feed line. Here's other ways if folks want to train gilts with just our door, being comfortable going through the door. You can see in the top left, same here at the bottom right.
Sounds like Haley knows that one well herself. So, yeah, this is just showing some different training ways. If you want to get your gilt some exposure to the door mechanism or the stall ahead of time, we're certainly supportive of that. But we also don't want to put a lot of expensive electronics down there on animals that aren't even bred yet. So having something that's simple, something that the animals can get used to without making it an extra labor step is pretty important.
Yep. And okay, so I'll go to this slide then. This is a good one because this is what we see a lot of times, going from all stalls to pins. So stalls on the left, pins on the right. And then bring your attention to the top, the number of sows also. So we were at 216 in stalls. So why were we less? And then more when we went to pins. I'm sure you can all see the aisles. So if you count the aisles on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 aisles on the left. We're showing 2 aisles on the right in the pin retrofit. Another thing we pay attention to is how many sows are in that breed group, how many going to farrowing. So if we're using our rough numbers of 15 sows to a station, it's a 3-station pin. So 45 animals, let's say. So if I've got 45 or 90, that way you know how many is going to farrowing per week in a static group. But we get our extra square footage based off, a lot of times, removing aisles, especially if we're on a total slat barn. Yeah, I know we've got quite a few of these examples, and it does make a difference if I'm total slat versus partial slat. Yep. But you can see what a typical, there's a good one. So stalls on the right, up to 35 or 42 days preg check, and then they go to pins. That's before Prop 12, that's what we had seen a lot of, or I can speak to that too. But talking about animal welfare in general, hopefully you are talking in your classes about that. So if I'm protecting the sow, she's protected in a stall until she's confirmed. Then we try to minimize aggression when we do mix her in the pen, and there's strategies to do that. But mixing her one time so that she stays with that group until she goes to farrowing. Yep. And I think a takeaway message is we pay attention to the dimensions also. Like I said, have access to water, so one sow isn't blocking access to feed or laying in front of a water. And these are other good examples showing, it might not be half a barn, it might be keep the stalls in one section of the barn, and then the feed lines running right along the aisleway for their pins. So this is what we like to do here, keeping them close that way people can see the stations, but also visually check the sows. And then you can see these hospital pins are right along the aisle as well. Yeah, and this is current events right here. I'm sure you've all heard of it, but moving to Prop 12, so the 24 square foot requirement seems to get most of the attention. I still think the big attention is I cannot keep her in a crate longer than 6 hours in a 24-hour period. To me, that's the game changer. And then 24 hours within a 30-day period. Because like Hyatt was saying, then what do I do with her? I can't lock her in overnight. She cannot be to meet that requirement. I just can't go for the evening and come back the next morning, keep her in a stall. And that brings up the question, how do I feed her then? She can choose any stall to be in. With our ear tag, we can feed her with RFID reader because we can identify her. But in a free access stall or a stanchion, we don't know which one she's going to go into. I know Hyatt wants to talk about our Evo for GDU and finishing, so that's a good slide there.
Well, and I know we're getting close to our time limit too, Carissa. So if we've got specific questions, this would be a good time to have them. I don't want to run over too long either. I know you guys all have evenings to get to as well. So any questions on what we just discussed on the gestation side?
I don't see any in the chat at the moment.
So
I had a question, if you could take it. For a farm that would be moving from gestation crates to open pen, how difficult is the transition to get a P3, P4 sow to go from just having a normal feed drop to be able to use electronic feeders?
Very good question, Josh. So I can say that we've lived that because we've helped about 200,000 sows in the U.S. get to that point. So first of all, the expression I usually say is we're trying to teach an old dog new tricks, right? If we've got a gilt that's grown up in a pen, in a finisher pen, and then she moves to a breeding stall to be bred in, she doesn't really know how to behave yet in a non-pen environment. That's why we crate break her, right? That's why we get her used to being in a crate, because she sees that as something claustrophobic. So gilts usually adapt to pens just fine, but those old sows that have gotten used to being in a stall for a few years, they sometimes take a little bit longer to remember how to behave when they've got to be around other sows. They tend to usually be a little bit more aggressive. They tend to be a little grouchier, and they can also have a tendency to maybe want to lay down in a station from time to time. So they're the ones you really need that lay down bar for. The biggest thing, though, is those older sows are going to exert dominance hierarchy over other ones. So that's part of the reason why we try to segregate the younger ones from the older ones from a pen behavior and aggression standpoint. But we've got a lot of sows that have done that. And the biggest thing I would say, Josh, that I've seen is a high percentage of those sows that have been in stalls their whole life do just fine in pens. But there's some sows that if you kept her in a crate, you might allow her to stay in the herd longer than you would when you get her in a pen. A lot of times you can see them right when you walk them out of a stall. If they've got skis on their feet and their toes are really long, or they're really, really bad on their feet and leg structure, they're not usually the ones that are the best equipped to be successful in a pen. So I usually tell guys, turn her back around, put her back in a stall, get her through the next farrowing, and then probably put her on the cull truck. But luckily, that's usually a small percentage of the total number of animals that you're converting to pens.
Question.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I know. Yep, go ahead, Hyatt.
Well, I was just going to start talking about grow finish a little bit in gilt development. I think this is another application of the feed blending technology that is really interesting as you look to futuristic ways of getting sows and gilts fed. So our grow finish system is particularly being taken up by research and gilt development units. And one of the big reasons for that is a lot of on-farm gilt development units have various ages of gilts, usually small to medium-sized groups, within the same barn, and nutritionists are tasked with getting them fed the right diet. Those of you that have finishing experience, you're probably used to feeding 4 to 6 phases throughout the finishing period. Oftentimes that's challenging when we've got lots of different gilt ages and a limited number of feed systems and feed bins to get them fed the right diet. So one of the things that we're also trying to make sure we understand is we don't want to overfeed these gilts. And I'm going to skim through some stuff here, but by ad lib feeding or giving gilts full feed access all the way through finishing, we unintentionally create bigger gilts than we need a lot of times by the time they get to the farm. They're fatter than they need to be, they're larger frame than they need to be, and ultimately that just puts more onus on us to feed them more because their maintenance cost is going to be higher. And generally speaking, we create more feet and leg problems by getting those gilts over conditioned early. That's a great way to create long-term structural issues. So I would challenge you guys to think about what we do in other species and realize that maybe full feeding animals that we want to stick around for a really long time isn't the best long-term strategy for managing gilts. So we need to think about the fact that can we restrict feed these gilts at certain times, not only to save a little bit of money, but mainly to set her up for longer term success in the sow farm. And so as we think about GDU design, again, I'm skipping through some slides. Here's an example of a farm that's utilizing our feed blending system in the gilt development unit, where we can give those girls a different diet or a different blend of 2 diets at different stages and hit their nutrient requirements much more correctly, but also be able to manage the way they have access to feed. But long term, I think we all really need to think about the fact that if we are ad lib feeding these gilts all the way through their life, are we really setting them up for longevity? Brian mentioned earlier that cull sows are worth a lot right now, so a lot of producers are not all that concerned about how many girls are leaving the herd. But I think as stockmen and long term, we need to think about, from an animal welfare standpoint, we'd like to keep these sows in the herd until they pay for themselves and have the ability to be in the herd for a long time and stay productive. And if we aren't setting them up for success early in their life, we're maybe not realistic with ourselves about how long we expect them to stay in the herd. Biological overload is a comment that really started in the dairy industry. I'll coin Temple Grandin on that one. She named that. But we have so much prolificacy in our genetics these days that they can eat a lot. And their littermate brothers are expected to eat a lot because they're going to market. But these gilts that can eat a lot can grow faster than we really want their skeleton and feet and legs to grow for them to have long-term longevity. I don't want to keep every sow around for 10 parities. That's not what I'm going for. But the fact that our industry average is less than 3 parities per sow for a nationwide average is pretty disappointing to me. It's disappointing to me that we're averaging 50 to 60% replacement rate on good farms. We have a lot of sow mortality issues on farms. Group housing probably doesn't help with that. But if we can set them up for success by growing and developing those gilts better, we have some real upside in our industry to raise a longer lasting animal that can have a better chance of having more return on their investment. And simultaneously, we're being better stockmen by taking better care of these animals instead of just trying to turn them through the system as fast as possible. So there's lots of opportunities with that feed blending, especially as we talk about gilt development. These are some of the opportunities that allows for those of you that maybe don't do that today but can think about those advantages. There's a lot of things that we can do when we add in the ability to blend multiple diets, and just adds a lot more flexibility to your farm. So for example, if we have 2 extreme diets, you might, instead of having to bring these customized gilt diets to your farm, if you work with your nutritionist, you already have a high nutrient diet, lactation, and a low nutrient diet, gestation, coming to your farm. And if you formulate it the right way, you could use those 2 base diets as the blends you use to develop your gilts and simplify what feeds need to be brought to the farm by your feed truck driver, and also limit what you've got the feed mill needing to produce for you. So if you think about some of those in a different context, there's some real upside to these opportunities for a little extra investment. The same rule can be applied to grow finish. I think it's a little harder to see the immediate payback if we have all the pigs at the same age. But what we're starting to see is more and more interest in the ability to feed pigs individually and grow finish. We know that we have growing pigs growing at different rates, but just think about where this is going. If we have an RFID tag in every pig's ear, which has a cost, but if we can show a payback for that cost, if we had an animal that consumed a certain amount of feed and was not growing fast enough, wouldn't it be best just to go ahead and get that animal marketed, even if they haven't reached their ideal endpoint? We could select for high feed efficiency, low feed efficiency animals and market them strategically if we really knew more about their individual performance. And I think that's going to become more and more of a topic as we get further down this line, and especially if feed costs get higher or stay high, those type of technologies are going to be more and more applicable because they can help us make labor limited decisions and also optimize the efficiency of use of our systems and our feed. So with that, I think we've run long on our time, but I hope you guys might have a few questions, and we can certainly back up to any questions that might be relevant.
I don't see any questions in the chat, so if you guys have any questions, go ahead and type those away. But Dr. Schinkel did put in the chat that he just got here. So.
Well, we need to be prepared for lots more questions now that Dr. Schinkel's here, right? I'm glad you're out of the hospital, Dr. Schinkel.
Yeah, it was emergency hernia surgery. I had it for a year, and they said it was elective. And then Monday it got strangulated, and oh, it was not good. They got it. So I'm fixed, but I can't do much for 8 weeks.
Well, thank you for that detail.
But just when the end of the semester is. Carissa, if you could write down the names of any students that are here. And
yeah, I took pictures of the participant list.
You talked about the balancing the two diets with the lactation diets.
I did, yes. I talked about it in brief. You know, we could probably spend an hour just on feed blending and lactation, but hopefully it gets everybody's wheels turning a little bit about what some of the new technologies and capabilities are out there. Just because we've been doing it the way we've been doing it doesn't mean we don't have a lot of upside of what we can do with new technologies available to us.
I agree very much with that.
Now, that being said, it's easier said than done. I'll tell you, the programming and software development is challenging, but it can be done. So we have a question on how does the 4-feed system work? That's a good question. Somebody saw the feed line head that had 4 different feed lines. So theoretically, we can actually blend up to 4 different diets, but most of the time that's overkill. But we do have research farms that want to have the ability to feed 4 different diets to animals that are on different experimental treatments and often maybe in the same pen in gestation, for example. So that feeder that can do feed blending has the ability to attach onto 4 side-by-side feed lines. I could go back to that slide, but it might take me a while. We can then designate, based on what animal or animals are underneath that feed line head, which diet they get. And so at a research barn, oftentimes we're going to place those pigs, regardless of what production phase they are, and then we're going to allocate them to treatments. And we may want to do that randomly throughout the barn to represent different environmental locations and behavioral situations. So we can do that and still get any of A, B, C, or D diets to those pigs. And we can still blend 2 of those diets if that wants to be a treatment, like a lysine titration, for example, where we want to blend different ratios of 2 diets. But the 4 feed line system is mainly for research applications. To my knowledge, I haven't seen a really compelling argument for using that in large-scale commercial systems yet. But we have the ability to research it, and that's the role of universities like Purdue to chase after some of those nutrient research trials so that we can learn a little bit more about the best way to utilize precision feeding. Looks like we might be wrapping up with that question, Carissa. Did you have anything else for us?
Nope, that's all I had. A few people did get on late. In my email that I sent out last time, we had the officer application. So if you guys want to be a president, vice president, or secretary, it's a good thing to put on a resume. Just fill out the application and send it to Dr. Schinkel. But if that's our last question, I'd like to thank our speakers again for spending another night with us and giving us a lot more information. Probably have like 5 more of these and I'd still be learning things. So thank you.
Well, I think you guys are probably sick of Gestal conversations after this, but I hope we've given you a little bit of a taste of what we deal with in the real world and in real world production. And I'll reiterate to you guys in the university setting, there are a lot of opportunities for talented young people in the swine industry. And if it's something you think you can get excited and passionate about, there's going to be opportunities for you in various roles and a lot of fun things you can do. So I hope that we've given you a little bit of taste about where the industry's going and what we can do today. And if you got more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Brian, and we'd be happy to enlighten you further or guide you in the right direction from what we can say.
I reiterate, thank you for us as well. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and Haley says thank you too.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Have a good night and enjoy the spring weather.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. This was great.